Um, Welcome, friends, to our Introduction to Reconstructionist Judaism, Recon 101. We'll start with a melody and just a brief moment of sort of pause, reflection, thinking about why we're here, what we hope to learn, and then we'll do a blessing for having this opportunity to learn together. Just notice how the melody and the sounds reverberating in your body. Take a few deep breaths. Feel the gratitude, appreciation for being alive, for being here. Being in such a rich and curious and open, creative community, invested in your well-being and in the common good. Gratitude to be inheritors, heirs of a rich, vibrant, and ancient community and chain of wisdom of Torah. Offer a bracha, a blessing for this opportunity. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right. So we learned about Reconstructionist Judaism. Awesome.
Yes.
And some of you read the book Exploring Judaism? Anybody with a chance besides Ginny? Anybody?
I have it,
You
and I
have it?
think I read the introduction.
I got Charlie and Helen have read it, and wonderful. It looks like Kathy too. There's Glenn and Rosie. Good to see you. Welcome. All right in time. We're just okay. So Reconstructionist Judaism, or in terms of the array of approaches to Jewish life out there. There's a avoidance or reluctance to call them denominations because of this concept of Klal Yisrael, all of Israel is one. That we don't want to emphasize necessarily the differences between us. There's plenty of that going on, right? But there are distinctions between the ways we approach how we make choices individually and communally for Jewish life. And of the common denominations and movements, we have the first Reform, and then the Orthodox response to Reform, and then the Conservative trying to find a middle ground between the Orthodox and the Reform, and then the Reconstructionist in broad sweeps looking for a middle ground between the Conservative and the rest. If I were to if people know reform and conservative, but want to know in 10 seconds or less what constructionist is, I usually say it was a progressive breakup of the conservative movement, which is true. Okay. So more progressive on social issues in particular than conservative movement, probably more traditional than the reform movement on ritual and matters of practice. So those are some of the, on one foot, if you had to answer it. On the website of the institution that is the hub of the Reconstructionist movement, which is now called Reconstructing Judaism. That's the name of the institution. On the website, they have this paragraph about where you get the notion Reconstructionism, because in American history, fields, Reconstructionism has different associations. So I'll just read this aloud. So the name Reconstructionism. And Mom, did you want to keep your hand up, or were you just raising that you read the book? Okay, no problem. All right, just didn't know if you had a question or a comment. The name Reconstructionism was adopted by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Everybody say Mordechai Kaplan.
Mordecai Kaplan.
All right, Mordechai Kaplan. In the 1920s, so just over 100 years ago, in 1923, published a book called Judaism as Civilization. So he adopted this name, Reconstructionism, to communicate that Judaism itself, its structure, its lost my place, beliefs, rituals, customs, and culture must be reconstructed in each generation to renew its relevance and ensure its sustainability. So I'll read it again. So that Judaism itself must be reconstructed. We are proud to carry, in order to renew its relevance and ensure its sustainability. We are proud to carry on Kaplan's legacy of grounded, purposeful, and brave innovation. Those are very deliberate word choices. Applying our understanding of Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. We draw from the rich well springs of Jewish tradition to face the challenges and opportunities of the current moment. Okay, there's a lot packed into that. What did you see? What did you notice or stood out for you?
It sounds to me like you have to keep up with the modern world.
Okay. Yeah,
That's.
there's a piece of keeping up with the modern world.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I think there's more work involved than just taking a dogma. Because you have to take the Torah and apply it to everyday life, which I think is a challenging thing, but I think it's absolutely necessary.
Very good. Anything else? Anything you didn't expect to see?
Well, I don't know, but I like it, brave innovation, brave,
Uh-huh.
not just innovative.
Uh-huh.
There's pretty much nothing that's not brave about the Jewish people. So it's sweet that it's stated that way.
What's your interpretation?
My interpretation? Oh, you'll get an hour and a half of that tonight. Yes.
With the other sects, the ultra-religious, the Lubavitch,
Uh-huh.
the typical Orthodox, conservative, and how do they look upon the totality of Reconstructionism as part of the Jewish being?
Oh, I like that image, that metaphor of the Jewish being. It reminds me of Reb Zalman, Shechter Shlomi, talked about thinking about the Jewish people as an organism, like the Reconstructionists are like the frontal cortex. and the Orthodox are like the hands, and the Reform are like the heart, and like, the Conservative are like the liver. Like each one serves a different function of the whole body, right, of Jewish community.
Without one, you don't have the totality then. That,
That's right. And not no one, like the eyeballs are not the totality of the human being,
right,
right? Now, so the image that you invoked, I want to celebrate, and I would see that as very much a reflection of a Reconstructionist approach to see value in Orthodox. We're not competing with, this is the right form of Judaism. We want there to be and celebrate Orthodox Judaism and Conservative Judaism and Reform and Humanistic Judaism and secular, and Jewish renewal and all the different forms of Jewish expression. That was part of what Kaplan was trying to articulate, which you hinted at. Now, in the world of Chabad and in more ultra-Orthodox circles, that's probably not the metaphor they will choose.
So I'll give you an anecdote. I have a first cousin who's Lubavitch. He's beyond Lubavitch. He's a scribe and writes Torahs and all that. And we speak quite often. So in my wisdom, you were not the only recipient of my wisdom.
Thank God.
I asked him, so what do you think about Israel requiring all the Lubavitch to serve in the military, in a non-military, and I know this guy. I'm 2 years older than him, so I know him a long time, and I never saw emotion from him like this, and he went off. It was like a sermon.
Very upset about assuming? Was he upset about the ruling?
Yes.
Yes, yeah,
yes. And I wasn't going to debate him, but he's such a sweet guy. But I was just asking.
Well, in my encounters, that I will say that of all and the many Orthodox teachers that I've had and colleagues and people that I've met, you cannot judge, you cannot presume that their attitude toward Reconstructionism is the same. That almost all of them have a different approach. Some are considered a total threat to Judaism and, worse than being a different religion, right? Converting out of Judaism is to be, it can be to that extreme, or it can be, I'm a student of Kaplan and, he helps me. I mean, part of what Kaplan was doing was creating an intellectually honest Judaism for Orthodox yeshiva bachers in New York. Right. So that was his sort of first audience, was, trying to give a way, to make sense of Judaism in a modern world for people who were in an Orthodox world. His father was an Orthodox rabbi. He was brought from, I think, Lithuania to to oversee the kashrut, the kosher restaurants and butchers for New York City. It was like he was a huge, I mean, it was a prominent rabbinic family. His father was a prominent rabbi, and was, came from the Orthodox world and from a Musar background, in Lithuania. Anyway, so in this description, brief description, right, of Reconstructionism, you have the sort of the bolded piece. Oh, and I apologize, you guys. I can screen share. It's just hard for me to see you when I do. So I'll pull this description up so you can see it. And I can have Elizabeth email this to you after, so you would have the document. This definition of Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So the first thing to note is, closing the doors, Jim. That Kaplan is rejecting the definition of Judaism as a religion. Judaism is not a religion. That was the name of the book, was Judaism as Civilization. It's not a religion. Because a religion is the,
Well,
and
it says about evolving religious.
that as an adjective,
Yeah.
right?
Okay,
But
not a
not
noun.
as a noun. And because the definition of Judaism, of religion, and variances of religions was based primarily on belief systems. And there are as many different belief systems within Judaism as there are. Right? People ask me, what do Jews believe about, the afterlife? I say there are many Jewish beliefs about the afterlife as there are beliefs about the afterlife, right? You cannot identify, membership in the Jewish community by what you believe or don't believe. So with that definition of Judaism, it's not a religion. And so that's the first thing. This is this has enormous implications around debates around anti-Semitism. As you're defining Semitism, right, anti-Jewish hatred as against a race or a religion or what is it? Because it's hard to define. And nobody had a working definition. And that's why, so when Kaplan wrote this book, Judaism and Civilization, it was a National Book Award. It was a huge deal. He's a terrible writer. Desperate need of an editor. I mean, just like verbose and, in contrast to like Abraham Joshua Heschel, the two of them were close and, both luminaries of the 20th century in the Jewish world. And Kaplan was an incredible sermon giver, like renowned, and he taught homiletics for 40 years in the Conservative Theological Training Seminary. That's what he taught, was how to give a sermon. Incredible sermon giver, but writer. Yeah. So it's hard to read Judaism and Civilization or any of his books, which is why this one is what I gave you. The ideas in it and offering a definition and as a visionary for what Judaism is, defining what it is, and how it can interact with, as Berner said, the modern world, the current times. And so it provided an ideological framework and a methodology for doing Jewish in America that has had more influence than any other thinker. I think that's universally recognized. Among conservative and honest Reform rabbis as well. So this definition is no small thing. And what we're going to do is basically go through each word of this definition and talk about what that means. What are the implications of it and how it approaches. And my hope is, in terms of the broader picture of this two-part series, is that I'm going to give you the sort of, it's going to be mostly in our heads, right? The language and some of the history and concepts about the ideological approach, this Reconstructionist approach to Jewish life today, and maybe a little taste of some examples like from the prayer book. And then next week, we'll talk about Zionism from a Reconstructionist lens, especially, and we'll talk about liturgy and Jewish practice in specific ways. So we'll apply these principles to how we do Jewish. Okay, that makes sense?
Yes.
All right. So renew relevance, right? These two functions: renew relevance and ensure sustainability. So the piece that Kaplan is asserting, and with plenty of knowledge and history to back it up, is that it's not just in the 20th and 21st centuries that Judaism has had to evolve. It's since Abraham, right? That this reconstruction of Judaism is not a new thing. It's what's always been happening in every generation. Otherwise, it would not have survived. And the difference is we are doing it consciously. we're aware that that's what we're doing. Okay. Now that is in contrast to some forms of orthodoxy, which sort of hold the idea that the Judaism that we practice now is what Abraham did, and Moses did, and Akiva, and Hillel and Shammai, and Maimonides, and and on. That the form of Judaism, how we did Shabbat, how we keep kosher, how we observe Passover, right? How we pray, same, unchanging. And that is a common Orthodox narrative that Kaplan simply says, not so. And the most obvious example is that our ancestors used to, instead of davening Mincha, Mariv, Shachrit, they would bring sacrifices to a temple and slaughter animals. I'm not going to let us do that here. Right? That when the temple was destroyed and animal sacrifice, right, became no longer an option. So we adjusted and we invented things like computers that need batteries, chargers. So we invented things like synagogues, liturgy, Passover seders, all-night studies for Shavuot. That these are rabbinic innovations that would be an anathema to Abraham and Moses and Joshua, right? That's an example of how it had to reconstruct what it did, and how it built community and perpetuated the core values of the Jewish people. Yeah.
One thing I always think about is during the pogroms, they reconstructed Judaism by hiding it. And that was reconstructing Judaism because it kept it alive. And so you think of, what had the rituals that continued, and if they had stopped, what would we be?
Yeah.
So they were reconstructionists.
That's right. And I think what Kaplan, sort of heroes of Kaplan were people like Maimonides and Rabbi Yochanan and who boldly initiated radical changes in the expressions of Jewish life, in the manifestations, but they were not subtle, and they knew what they were doing. But then a generation later, then they look back on it and say, oh no, it was always done like Maimonides did or Rabbi Akiva did, right? So that it's a rewriting of history, sort of, that the intent is good, right? It's a sense of it has authority, right? It's authentic. That the presumption that in order for it to be authentic religious expression, it had to have been, go all the way back to Abraham. And Kaplan's saying, no, that's not correct. What does it need to have authority and authenticity? It needs a core values, core principles, and that the legal structure and the ritual practice and the moral, the ethics, right? Those evolve from the core principles. And so that is the framework. There's this, this idea of values-based decision-making, sort of a late 20th century, framework, moral framework for how to make decisions. So he's saying that was what we've been doing all along, right? Identifying what our core values were and then figuring out how to adjust the traditions and the laws to fit those core values. And it's not just like transforming what happened in the Bible, but the Bible is already doing, you can see the reconstruction, 5 women complaining that daughters couldn't inherit land. And Moses going to God and saying, yeah, they're right. Let's change that law, right? So that it's not just even post-biblical, it's already in the Bible and code. All right. as you know, you guys, you all know me, jump right in if you have comments or questions. Okay, so Reconstructionist approach is infused by core commitments, right, to core values. So the first identified here is learning from the vast storehouse of Jewish wisdom and practice, while understanding that, quote, the past has a vote, not a veto. So that's a Kaplanian quote, probably the most famous of them, other than defining Judaism as a religious civilization. This idea that you have to let the tradition be at the table, right? You have to find out and understand what is the history and what are the traditional practices. And then the past doesn't have a veto. So if if the rabbi's the only one who says we have to do a Torah service on Yom Kippur, but everybody else around the table says, yeah, let's try something new, then, I don't have a veto, or the tradition doesn't have a veto, right? So that's part of the evolution. There's some wonderful Talmudic stories that demonstrate this. It's not a new idea, okay? Let me just share one. So there's a story in the Talmud about the end of the age of prophecy, right? A pretty substantial, framework for religion was that God spoke directly through certain prophets, mostly men, a couple of women, and that they communicated to the people what God intended, and you did it or you didn't, right? So there's a story, and you could tell who was a prophet because what they said came true, or they could work miracles. So there's a Rabbi Eliezer is the head of the yeshiva, the Sanhedrin. There's a handful of other guys, and they're debating about an oven. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Right? It's been brought to them. So Rabbi Eliezer, let's just say, I don't remember which one, he says it's kosher, the others say he says not kosher, the others say it's kosher. And Rabbi Eliezer is so upset, he says, if I'm right, this river will flow backwards. And it does. And the guy, the colleagues look at him and says, oh, that's pretty impressive, but we're still not convinced. Okay, if I'm right, then this tree will bend in half of its own accord, and it does. He says, still not convinced. Right. And he's so upset. He says, okay, if I'm right, the walls of the Beit Midrash, right, will collapse. And they start to collapse. And Rabbi Joshua, the sort of, teenager, 20-something whippersnapper, says to God, the Torah is not in heaven, which is a quote from the Deuteronomy, from the Bible. God said, Moses says on behalf of God, right? The Torah is not in heaven. It was given to Israel and decided by majority rule. And the Talmud says, and God laughs, right? So you might have the power, God, you might be right according to God, majority rules. So it's a really radical story, right? It's in the Talmud, Chagiga. And that's an example, right? Of this evolution that we're
The
trying.
best part of that story is that God laughs.
Oh, yeah, right. Exactly. Okay. So this principle of giving tradition a vote, but also recognizing that it has to evolve in order to survive, right? Which is a different kind of faith than we should do it like it's always been done, and that's the way it will survive. Right, so okay. The second core commitment. This is living fully in two civilizations, drawing from the best practices of both Jewish and contemporary non-Jewish society. So I'll give some egalitarian decision-making processes, commitments to advancing freedom and equity for all, etc. It's not that these aren't Jewish values, but they're maybe more primary in contemporary American society, right? Particularly in the 20s, as suffrage and the role of women and women's rights. So Kaplan was arguing for a Judaism that wasn't ghettoized, that was the opposite of ghettoized. If we are going to succeed as a community in an emancipated country, then we're going to have to get out of the ghetto and celebrate and take from the best of non-Jewish civilization that we live in, our neighbors. So he described that as living in two civilizations, the Jewish civilization and the traditions and the inheritance, the ghetto, Judaism, and American society. How this plays out in terms of Jewish practice is that there's an opening up to sociology of religion and secular study of the Bible and history and other fields. Chaim Potok's, the chosen, these are stories about that opening up of the Jewish world to the broader world, to baseball, and so he's articulating not only that that's not a transgression, but actually the best innovations in Judaism have always done this. For example, the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder is the most successful Jewish ritual in the last 2,000 years. More people, more Jews continue to practice the Passover Seder than any other Jewish ritual. Non-Jews know about it, right? And it's fulfilling the function of affirming Jewish identity and carrying on Jewish narrative, right? So where did it come from? Greek philosophia, right? So at the time of the invention of the Seder, you have elements of, food like bitter herbs and matzah in the Bible, in the Torah, in Exodus, in Exodus. But the idea of a meal, doing the storytelling and the philosophical debate with wine, plenty of wine, and meal, and reclining, and asking questions for questions, and having multiple answers, and singing songs, that's completely stolen from the Greek symposia as a practice, or borrowed, or integrated. That best practice, which, the rabbis who were engaging in that kind of studying secular studies, Greek studies, and this Jewish practice of Passover, in integrating them. So you can't say that isolating ourselves from the broader culture is good for Jewish life. If some of the most successful innovations of Jewish life came about as a result of the cross-fertilization of Jewish and non-Jewish rituals and practices and theologies and philosophies, etc. So there has always been, especially in turning points, successful adjustments in Jewish civilization, this intermingling. Okay, so so he gave that a name. That's living fully as Americans and Jews, in Jewish and American civilization. And this, where he's in the 20s and 30s, and this women's rights. So his daughter was the first bat mitzvah, and women being fully incorporated into Jewish life, and pushing the conservative movement and the Orthodox on that question, That was an expression of him doing that. So it wasn't just, he's not just naming it, he's actually practicing it, Okay, the third one, thinking, dreaming, and making decisions within the context of our communities, past, present, and future. Okay, Kaplan, one of his criticisms of the Reform movement is the Reform movement emphasized individual autonomy. Every person gets to decide for themselves whether they keep kosher or observe Shabbat or, go to the, civil rights march, etc. That those expressions of Judaism were located, the power, the autonomy was located in the individual. This is also a borrowing from, Locke and Hume and, modern political theory, and moral theory. But what Kaplan saw as missing in that is the community, right? The collaborative decision-making. And that he said that the decisions about our, especially communal practice, should be a collaborative and collective process. So individuals shouldn't be making those decisions on their own. We can celebrate individual autonomy, especially, what you do on your own time, but in terms of the practice, collaborative practice. So the role of the rabbi would then shifted, right, in dramatic ways, right? So in the Orthodox world, what's the role of the rabbi?
He's the final say.
The expert in Jewish law. If you want to know whether you should do it or not do it, you ask the rabbi and he tells you, and it's a he.
Yeah,
And what's the role of the rabbi in reform?
there's multiple group decisions.
Well, in the reform movement, it was actually the same. That the rabbi was put in charge of all ritual decisions related to the synagogue. It wasn't any different. And the conservative didn't know what the role of the rabbi was. So the Reconstructionists said, so that, the ancient model is this idea of a Sanhedrin, a deliberative body with different perspectives, trying to, debate and argue to come to a decision. So it wasn't individual autonomy. And so it had a collaborative process, but it was exclusive. It was the rabbis, the elite educated scholars, who came from all walks of life and all different classes. It wasn't elite in terms of economic, so the Reconstructionist movement is saying that the function of the rabbi is not to be the decision maker, or the posek is the Hebrew, like the one who decides Jewish law, but to guide a community in a collaborative decision-making process. That's the function of the rabbi. And because of the likelihood of the rabbi, not necessarily, but the likelihood of being one of the most expert in Jewish tradition and history, so to give that perspective a vote. Right? So that's how I was trained. So it's, talk about it as rabbi, as facilitator of decision-making processes, rather than a posek, a decision maker, the final say kind of thing. And that's, so among the radical innovations of Reconstructionism, that's a very new definition. So, for instance, how does the Reconstructionist movement practice that? So when the Reconstructionist movement created a prayer book, which this congregation bought early on, as you heard about at one of the last adult education things, right? That it created a prayer book commission with an equal number of rabbis and lay leaders from the Reconstructionist communities. That it wasn't just created by the rabbis. The Reform prayer book, the Conservative prayer book, of course, the Orthodox, were all just created by rabbis. So there's a recognition of sort of the role of the rabbi in that place. And certainly that's how I was trained in terms of, being in a congregation or community that is creating practices, that you're not the one to make the decisions, even though you know the most about you might know the most about the Aleinu prayer and the history of how it is, but in terms of what you sing and what you say, that should be a collaborative decision process. So that's also a recovery of a traditional practice as much as an application of a contemporary ethic. That makes sense.
Is what you're teaching us today and next week incorporated in the curriculum of our Hebrew school? Well, that's too
you're getting the behind the scenes why our curriculum looks like it does.
okay.
Okay? Why we do what we do in the synagogue and why we do things like Musar, right? So we'll get to that too. Okay. So an extension of that is this piece of empowering one another to reconstruct and co-create rituals, practices, even texts, in order to build the Jewish community we want to live in, right? So that's the idea of reconstruction, right? That we should, it's like an example of in 1984, when the Reconstructionists created a commission, again, rabbis and lay leaders, on homosexuality. So one of the prescriptions was, now we need to go create wedding ceremonies for gay couples, and naming ceremonies and funeral liturgy that honors gay spouses and children of gay couples, etc. So we need to create rituals to recognize that the full breadth of our and diversity of our community. There's a wonderful resource called ritualwell.org, which is a collection of new innovative rituals. One of the ones I've been trying to find a partner to do is creating a calendar, like a counting the Omer calendar for those going through infertility treatments, right? There are ways in which our tradition, because of modern advances in medicine, didn't have rituals for artificial insemination, right? So what blessing do you say? And so we've always been creating blessings. It's not new but because of, and in large part because of the Holocaust, a contraction and a defensiveness about the tradition for fear of diffusion and assimilation, right? So this is the boldly, right? That's the creative enterprise of creating new rituals to recognize the evolving state of Jewish life. Any questions or about those core commitments?
So just a comment. So you just talked about assimilation. So really this is saying that it's about growing the civilization of the people versus assimilating the Jewish people. So we're really different ideas, taking things and incorporating them as a Jewish civilization, as opposed to assimilating, diffusing the civilization.
Yeah, there's an inherent, I think, like trust in the durability of Jewish life and practice and ritual and narrative, right? Like this, there's that it doesn't feel threatened by introducing the idea of a Passover Seder or a creating a healing service or a Tisha B'Av service, on Mount Falcon, or John Denver Shabbat, right? That's not a diffusion, but an enrichment. Is that
Yeah,
what you're articulating? Yeah. It's in that sense, I think that's where it's bold and hopeful and trusting that Jewish civilization has enduring power, and actually it's not contracting and putting up walls, protecting what we have always done, that is going to lead to the endurance of the Jewish people, Jewish civilization. In fact, it's the opposite, right? As a whole, right? I mean, there are parts of Jewish tradition that are being preserved. Thank you. Being preserved because there are, people davening, the traditional liturgy 3 times a day, and that can know the Talmud by heart, right? There's advantages to that too. Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, it occurred to me that living fully in 2 civilizations piece is really an answer to the question of assimilation. That yes, it's possible to be American and Jewish and gain from both rather than having to worry about being subsumed by American culture and bled out of Judaism. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's well articulated and a nice wrapping of that concept. Okay, so I want to move a little bit more quickly. Oh, yeah, Irene, go ahead.
It occurs to me from what you're saying, how American Reconstructionism is. Really American, and in all the best aspects of our Constitution and everything. And I was wondering how it manifests in other countries, how recon manifests in other countries.
Mhm.
If it has,
Yeah,
and I don't even know how many countries have a recon congregation.
so that's a great question. Yes, and it's often pointed out that of the conservative, Orthodox, Reform, and Reconstructionist movements, the Reconstruction is the only one that was born in America. That's
Mm.
native to American soil, right? Conservative and Reform were both born in Germany, Orthodox also in Germany, different forms of Orthodoxy in different forms of different places and regions. The conversation, this question, Irene, is there are Reconstructionist congregations, I think, in Germany, in Holland. There might be another, but one of the things that the movement did deliberately, it's certainly in Canada, was to not impose the label of Reconstructionism, but to offer like the services of a rabbi and the services of the movement, and help teach about Mordecai Kaplan's ideas, and to see what that created in that environment.
Hmm.
And that's been especially true in Israel. So there's at least one congregation that's affiliated with the Reconstructionist movement. It's interesting, it's mostly Russian immigrants that are part of the congregation, but there are other congregations that are very much Reconstructionist in their approach, and their rabbis are overtly Kaplanian. You sent me, a video clip of David Hartman, Kaplanian through and through. I mean, I think that's probably why you sent it to me, right? And he's the Hartman Institute is an educational center in Jerusalem. I think there were half a dozen rabbis from Denver that studied there this summer, conservative, Reform, Orthodox. They go to Hartman. So the idea wasn't to, and Kaplan himself did not want to start a new movement. He was very opposed to it. He was hoping he would, convince the conservative movement, what became the conservative movement, to sort of adopt this approach. They didn't. They let him continue to teach for decades, but his students convinced him to start a new movement.
Oh.
Ira Eisenstein, his student, and then his son-in-law was really the first president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the movement. So his hope was to influence the Jewish world, did not intend to start an own movement. And that's the approach in certain terms of the idea of let the ideas of Reconstructionism influence Jewish civilization in its places, and see what creates what emerges institutionally in those different locales.
Question, is there Reconstructionism in Israel?
Yeah, well, so there's a Reconstructionist congregation. There's other congregations that are affiliated with the Reform movement, which has more services and more institutional structure, but the leaders identify as Kaplanian or Reconstructionist in approach, and other institutions. And Kaplan himself was asked to be the president of the University of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And so there's a recognition that his ideas had a place in Israel, and might be just what sort of was needed in terms of the fractioning of Jewish identity as people are moving from all different speaking all Yiddish and Hebrew and German and Yemenite and, all these people moving to Israel over the course of, 100 years, but, and how do you create a shared identity? Like their Judaisms look nothing alike. They might practice Shabbat on the same day, if they practice Shabbat, right? So
But
so that
the Torahs are the same.
Yeah.
the Torahs are the same. That's right. Yeah. Mostly. Yeah.
There's always
Okay.
one holdout.
That's right, exactly. Okay. So then it's taking one word at a time in this definition. So looking more, what do we mean of the civilizational approach? So I'll look at the civilizational approach, the evolutionary approach, and the religious approach. So it's basically taking those three words, evolving, religious, civilization, and doing one at a time. So I want to go through this more quickly. After I go through it, we can look at invite questions and stuff. So let me pull up. So here's the civilizational approach. So what it does, right? Looking at Judaism as a civilization rather than as a religion, it gives legitimacy and standing to different ways of being Jewish. Cultural and political can be as significant as being religious, whatever that means, and invites people into the experience of expansive community we call peoplehood. So, in the turn of the century, right, you had this blossoming of like Yiddish theater, right, in New York and in the, right, were they going to shul on Shabbat? Were they, fasting on Tisha B'Av? Probably not. But was that Jewish culture? Of course it was, right? You have people, being freedom fight riders, right? And going down as their way of expressing their Judaism. Did they go to synagogue? Did they know what holiday it was? Probably not. Did they speak any Hebrew? So, and you have people, secular, identifying as Jews, moving to Israel, building kibbutzim, radical socialism, explicitly atheist, saying, this is our Jewish. What's the common thread there? So that's the civilizational approach provides this umbrella that doesn't distinguish, and prioritize any individual particular expression of Jewish life. That's part of what it accomplished. I think that's the biggest piece. The second piece is, this is a Kaplanian expression, putting belonging before believing and behaving. So this is a sociology of religion, that these are the three components of every religion, right? Every religious community, spiritual community, has these three components: what you believe, how you practice it, and who your community is. And Kaplan said, Kaplan grew up where belief and behavior was primary, right? That's the Jewish community he was raised in. And he's shifting that and saying, no, we need to put belonging first. And he said that the greatest spiritual need, not just of Jews, but of humanity in the 20th century, is a sense of belonging. But whatever we can do to engage and to nurture that need should be prioritized. So that's the piece about putting community or peoplehood before praxis or belief, and that's behind that civilizational approach, right? You're part of Jewish civilization. Promotes inclusivity as a core value, and it offers us the sense of tribe, of kinship, of family, right? Which is behind the sort of make America, America first or Jewish first impulse, right? We see it in all stripes, but without the tribalism or chauvinism that our tribe is the best tribe or the only tribe. So this next phrase, Jewish, less by descent and more by consent and assent. So what does that mean? So that identity, rather than it being something you inherited, right, by descent, your parents are Jewish, your mother's Jewish, what have you, that Jewish identity, primary aspect of Jewish identity was about choosing the way you wanted to express your Judaism, or the affiliation, a sense of belonging with Judaism, or agreeing to, consent or assent, right? Does that make sense? So it's an approach to the tribalism piece, the concern about tribalism, right? We have the beginning of fascism and, obviously anti-Semitism and, Hitler, in the after World War I, the seeds of that in this country, racism and in Germany. And so there's addressing that, and also the internal Jewish identity, given the diversity of Jewish identity. All right. All right. The evolutionary piece we've covered a bit of, so I shouldn't have spent too much time on this. The idea that the Judaism that we live and practice today is the result of millennia of constant evolution. That we do not practice the same Judaism as Abraham or Moses or Maimonides, etc. That it has evolved, and that's a good thing. From generation to generation and country to country, rabbis, teachers, individual Jews, and entire communities have created ever new, different, and more personally relevant and contemporary ways of crafting their identities and celebrating values, customs, and authentic beliefs. That these evolutions are not new, right? When we talk about like the way Kabbalah thinks about God, right, as different from the way, the Pharisees might have, or Jeremiah, right? This evolution is not new. And while our ancestors may have attributed evolutions of Judaism to God's will in the past, we acknowledge that people were and are the agents of godly change. That is a shift. That's a contemporary shift in terms of, if you understood as God as a separate force operating upon you rather than through you, it's not the only, right? So this idea, if you think of God, and we have evidence of over the last millennia and more of Jewish leaders, philosophers identifying God operating through us. So that makes more, it's a recovering and uplifting that principle of God working through us. And thus it's not only our opportunity, but it's our obligation. So that's we embrace the opportunity and obligation to reconstruct, implement change, to renew Judaism's relevance, ensure continuity, and align Jewish practice with our highest values, or corrective with, contemporary values. So the evolution. Okay. So, as you mentioned, it does use religious as an adjective. So what do we mean by religious? What is the role of religious principles and practices in this civilization? So this is what I'm first doing here is to defining Kaplan's approach to what is religious. Okay, because it's not how many mitzvahs you observe, you practice, and how much Torah you know. Okay, so religious approach is an approach that seeks answers to big questions. Why we are here, what we are called to do in this life. It seeks and shares experiences of awe and wonder. So, when you say, are you religious? What do you mean by that? Right? Does it mean you believe certain things or that you practice in a certain way? So that's probably the most common uses of it. But in this, it's saying, do you ask existential questions? And are you a person who strives for and values a sense of wonder and awe? That's religious. That's the measure of religiosity. Yes.
So we have to go back to mitzvahs and knowing the Torah.
Okay,
It seems like a very important aspect of being Jewish that wouldn't be overlooked.
that, we'll get there.
Okay. Thank you.
We get there. We're almost there. Okay. And that's the next one here. So the religious approach asserts that a primary but not sole path to living a meaningful and fulfilling life is through the rituals, customs, holidays, rites of passage, prayers, and moments of everyday holiness that we experience through, you can say, traditional Jewish practice. So that is one of the a primary path to leading a meaningful, fulfilling life. To engage the holiday cycles, to offer a prayer before we study, a traditional prayer, to, not just sing John Denver songs, but say the Baruch Hu and the Shema and the Chadodi, right? That these provide a route and a foundation for living a meaningful life. Okay. So you notice the first three don't mention God. So we'll mention God. God and godliness. So for Reconstructionists, or I would say maybe in a Reconstructionist approach, God is understood not as something or someone to be believed in, but rather to be experienced in the everyday blessings and challenges of our lives, and to be made manifest through our own loving and righteous actions. Right? The right, part of the legacy of both biblical language, prayer language, and particularly Christian interpretation of biblical and prayer and Jewish practice is this notion of God as an external force operating upon the world and humanity. And you can call that a transcendent God, this notion of a God as right above and beyond. And maybe the Reconstructionist approach maybe can be described as a more transnatural approach, or the immanent God operating through us rather than upon us. There's not a right or wrong. It's just a different metaphor. Okay? A different way of understanding how God interacts with the world.
One of the things that I've always thought about is, when we do something kind or nice, we do a mitzvah, whatever, we feel better. And to me, for me, that proves that there is God, because if not, we would all be just doing what was selfish. There would be no reason to do kind acts and you would just be selfish all the time and just be a sociopath. And so to me, that resonates, that when you do something kind and you do something nice and you help someone, you feel lifted. Why?
Yeah.
There has to be. That's for me, that's how I view it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we would just be all,
right.
Taking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, you can sort of the language we use to try to understand that experience can invoke, right? Then there must be a God who created us with this impulse to be of service to one another, right? To altruism impulse, and that's seems to be more aligned with, the way God wants the world to act, and right. So that's a description of that experience using the transcendent God metaphor. And so the Reconstructionist emphasis is, or alternative, right? Emphasis is you can also explain that experience, right? That the divine presence operates through me. And it's even sort of bolder, right? In some ways, the Kabbalistic piece is that when I do an act of kindness, I'm bringing God into the world.
Right, and in one of your sermons, it was a spark of the divine, and that really is, if we have a spark of the divine, just that spark, then that's why we feel better, because we have that little spark.
Yeah, 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 yet another metaphor. You know, this past year, the Musar group in particular studied this book, and I talked about it over the holidays a little bit, called God is Here, that talks about different metaphors for God, written by Rabbi Tova Spitzer, who Reconstructionist rabbi. So this, just the idea of expanding the ways we think about God, like is a, you know, and it's also, I think, driven in some ways by this inclusive impulse, right? That we want people who bristle at the idea of an external God, right? Who, you know, pulling puppet strings and deciding who gets cancer and who doesn't, you know, as I won't step foot in a shul because they're talking to God, and that's the God I think, you know, of when I hear the word God. And it's saying there's a lot of ways to think about God. And, you know, one of the things that used to be said about Kaplan, and, you know, Kaplan used to preach, and the Reconstructionist movement got this reputation of being sort of a hyper-rational movement. There's this idea that Kaplan would say, you shouldn't have to leave your brain at the door when you enter shul, right? You shouldn't have to suspend what you believe about the world and science and reason, you know, when you go to pray. So you want our prayer life, our prayer language to reflect our full understanding of the world, right? So that's sort of the intellectual integrity. I'm not going to, you know, sacrifice my intellectual integrity in order to participate in Jewish ritual. You shouldn't have to do that, and that's part of the adaptations to Jewish liturgy and practice that has evolved in the movement. Let me again just finish this piece about the religious, and then we'll open it up more broadly. So this understanding that all God languages or language are metaphoric, right? That anytime all language is metaphoric. So of course God language is metaphoric. The Reconstructionist approach tends to emphasize metaphors that are less hierarchical and vertical, transcendent, and more natural or humanistic or immanent. And again, this is a matter of emphasis and not a matter of right and wrong. And so thinking of God less as an external being acting upon us and more as a force or power working through us through natural and moral law. And then use the word godly rather than God is. Godly is the power that animates life and the process of discovery as we encounter the natural world we inhabit. Godly is the love felt and fostered between us and in the highest strivings of the human spirit. So we shouldn't shy away from the language of the divine, of God. And we shouldn't have to, so we shouldn't avoid it altogether. And we shouldn't have to suspend our, you know, rational minds to engage it. And we have scores and scores of philosophical traditional Jewish treatises to help us do this. And we shouldn't just rely on, you know, a 12-year-old's theology way of thinking about God, right? As parent or as, you know, judge or king. When we engage the language of divinity. Okay?
In the spirit, though, of inclusivity, we would still be most welcoming of those whose belief system is that there is a God who rules over the world
Yes.
and who people find comfort in.
Mhm.
So we would still include that.
For sure.
Yes, okay.
For sure. And in fact, most of the prayer book, you know, if you do a literal translation, seems to reflect that theology. And we're not excising that theology from the prayer book or from the Torah or, right, from our, and we're offering, you know, alternative translations and beneath the line and the like, to open the door for those who aren't able to adopt that form, way of thinking about God. Yeah, Ginny.
So would we think that one of those that if I were a person who thought of a transcendent God or also a transpersonal eminent, are they mutually exclusive? They wouldn't be, right? I mean,
Right, absolutely.
because wouldn't God be a little bit bigger than all of that?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by it's all metaphoric, right? Meaning language can glimpse but not grasp or capture God, anything, but certainly God.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, and so the religious, what makes it religious is that it places as a primary path, again, not an exclusive path, to meaningful Jewish life, the sacred times, sacred spaces, synagogue and ark, a Torah, ritual items and practices as a central path. But the religion doesn't define the whole, right? The religious aspects, you might say, the traditions. And those religious aspects are subject to the same evolution as all other parts of civilization. In fact, you know, that's the ones we've been talking about, like the Passover Seder, right?
Mm.
Right. Okay. The last component, so it's 8:15. I'll do another 10 minutes on this, just maybe outlining it, and we'll next week dig into these sort of case studies. But let me just describe the process. So this is the piece part, I think, for me, it was, you know, of Kaplan's genius, not only of sort of assessing the situation, but of offering a methodology for doing reconstruction. Right? It's not only saying we need to change things up, right? Make it more modern, but here's how. Here's how you do that. And it's not something that he invented. He's adopting principles from traditional Jewish law, which already had to have systems for, you know, the expansion of law. Once you have, like, you know, electricity, what is that? You know, you can use that on Shabbat, right? So you need forms of adapting and you know, to apply law and principles to new circumstances. So what he articulated is this idea of functional reevaluation. Functional reevaluation. And that this is the process you would use when you encountered a law or a practice that was problematic, either because, you know, you didn't have a temple anymore and you can't do animal sacrifices, or because it's morally problematic because you're treating women as second-class citizens, or it's spiritually problematic because you're encouraging chauvinism and fostering that mentality and perspective that is damaging your relationship to other people. Right? Just to give a few examples, or it's not providing us the tools to respond to new crises like climate change or non-gender conforming, right, identities, and so functional reevaluation. So if you come across a practice that is, so I'll give the animal sacrifice, that is no longer, you're not able to do it anymore. So how do you reconstruct it? So the first thing you'd have to do is to identify the function it played in that society. So you distinguish between form and function. The form was sacrificing animals or grain or oil and things like that on the altar, priests and the whole cult, right? What was the function of animal sacrifices? Oh, well, there were lots of functions. Primary among them was giving expression to gratitude, right? Thanksgiving offerings, prayers for peace offerings, guilt offerings and sin offerings and atonement offerings to try to repair damage when you screwed up. Okay, so those are important functions. We don't want to live without those as a community. We need ways to accomplish those functions. So how do you do that? So they create an elaborate system of prayer, liturgy, and ritual. Chickens over the, we don't do all that anymore. We do this still, things like that. Bowing, rising, going up on your toes, bending knees, different forms of choreography, language, and melody to fulfill the same function as the animal sacrifices.
And let's not leave out fasting.
Okay, so fasting was one we could do in the temple and that we continue to do. So those are but prescribed fast. Well, that's sort of already biblical, like fast, like on Yom Kippur. So that's something we could continue. But let's say there was a health issue and you couldn't fast. So what was the function of fasting when you could? And how can I repeat that function or carry out that function with a different form? It's so simple, right? And yet it provides a foundation, a really, rational and justifiable, right? A foundation, and there's never going to be only one right answer. And that's where you need the community and the deliberation. So they got together and they over 100, 700 years, continuing today, developed a prayer, a liturgy, a prayer ritual that tried to fulfill those functions. There's, a group I've been doing every morning of a group of Israelis who are reciting Psalms, given the circumstances in Israel since October 7th. So they used to meet once a month, and as mostly women, praying the Psalms for Hallel for the new month together, and then decided after October 7th to do a different set of Psalms every day, with the prayer for returning of the captives and for Israel and the soldiers and the like healing. Right, that's a reconstructed ritual. There was no, for them it's 4 PM, psalm recitation, but they're using that technology to do what the animal sacrifices used to do, right? Or fasting might have done, right? So that's an example. So this same idea happens with the sort of more well-known. So if I was going to identify 2 sort of Reconstructionist innovations, bat mitzvah, obvious, I don't think I need to describe that, but so you may have noticed we have different language that we say when we do the Torah blessings. Next week we'll have more time, I'll pull them out, we can look at them. Where the traditional blessing says, and there are other places in the prayer book that have a similar language, blessed are you, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu et Torah. Blessed are you who chose us from among all the nations and gave us the Torah. All right, so this a short version. This is the chosen people idea. Jews is the chosen people. So Kaplan found this language particularly problematic morally for 2 reasons, if not more. One is that when non-Jews come to our services and hear us saying that we're the chosen people, they may leave with a bad taste in their mouths. This is not conducive to, neighborly relations. It's also not conducive to our own spiritual, moral frame of mind. If we're interpreting that passage, there are different ways to interpret it, of course, as chose us because we're better. We're more deserving of the Torah than other nations, right? I mean, think about it. When you tell your sibling, God, our parents chose me to give the waterbed to, right? Or whatever it was, right? So that, it's a sense of, besting or superiority or the chauvinism, right? So, found that problematic as an act of prayer. It's not fulfilling those functions of animal sacrifices that we described, the core functions. So the adaptation of the language, to change the language, to first identify the function. What's the function of language like God who chose us, chose me? You chose me to be your rabbi, right? The function of that language is, it feels good to feel special, right? And we are special. So that's not like an illusion. Each of us is unique, made in the image of God, and invaluable. And it's good to have language in our prayers that reiterate that for us, reaffirm that for us. So can I fulfill that function without contrasting it or doing it in comparison to, my sibling or my neighbor? And so instead of blessed are you who chose us from among the other nations, right? You say, blessed are you who draws us or me close to your service. You gave me purpose by choosing to give Torah to us. So I feel special. See, it's a gift that you gave me that gives me a responsibility and a gift. And it's not defining my value in contradistinction to someone else's. So that's an example of functional reevaluation. The blessing, the language is fulfilling the same function as you were chosen, right? By God. That feels good. Without perpetuating a chauvinistic or morally problematic attitude, okay, or message. Sorry, I didn't screen share for you guys. Let's do that. So this is the functional reevaluation. So the second case study is about kashrut, reconstructing kashrut. So for, if you, for earlier generations, it probably taught that you keep kosher just because, right? Why can't I eat bacon? Just because, right? And there's not and there was even a resistance from having an explanation. Oh, so you don't get trichinosis, or having laws that you in keeping kosher was a significant part of Jewish identity and practice. And for most of Jewish history, it was a source of pride. It's not so much that way anymore. And that's interesting to think about. But so if you're not going to, do a traditional kosher diet, separating meat and milk, only eating, animals with cloven hoof, and only eating kosherly slaughtered animals, no shellfish, etc. Then if you're going to set that practice aside, so Kaplan would say, you don't just get to set it aside. You have to figure out what its function was, and then find another way that maybe fits better with your lifestyle or your ethics. So, so the notion of kashrut, again, in traditional circles, there was a resistance to coming up with whys, right? To talking about its function. But it's not hard to do if you try, right? This conscientious consumption, that's essentially what it is. What you put in your mouth, it matters to think about where it came from and what it is and what it does to your soul, not just your body. So being a conscious consumer can apply more to areas other than what you put in your mouth. It's where you spend your money. And so this notion of eco-kashrut, of being engaging in conscientious consumption, right? What you purchase and what you eat, what you consume as a consumer, that factors in the crisis of global warming as fulfilling a similar function. Maybe that's a new function, but it's an adaptation of a clear principle of being conscientious about what you eat, and doing so for a higher purpose, right? That's the function, and you're associating a higher purpose with environmental, sensibility and conservation, perhaps. So examples of that would be, like if you ordered a kosher meal on the airplane, right? Back when they served food on airplanes, it was wrapped 6 times in cellophane and styrofoam, and right, it's like the most non-recyclable thing you can ask for. So instead, as a kashrut practice, to order the vegetarian meal or to bring your own food, right? So when I was in rabbinical school, there were people who wouldn't eat, some people won't eat dairy meal on a meat plate. And they said they wouldn't eat on a styrofoam plate or a non-recyclable plate. So it's an application of the principles of kashrut given a new sensibility. And so it's not just, so I think often the Reconstructionist approach is seen as you can be less really, practicing. You can be less strict about what you do. But there are forms of eco-kashrut where you're actually being more strict, more intentional and restrictive about what you eat or consume or do. And it's not just a watering down, that it could be a more intensification, right? I think, in terms of Musar practice, like that, the intentionality of choosing a quality of character every day, and that, this is an intense practice. It's not for, feeble-hearted, right?
It's not Jewish life.
It's not Jewish life. Exactly. That's the language. That's right. It's not Jewish life. It's not just a watering down of these traditions. It can be an enrichment. Okay, so next time we will look at, maybe I'll pull out, we can do some of the blessings. I want to invite you to also think about in the week interim, about what aspects of this approach resonate with you and what are more foreign or more uncomfortable. How does CBE embody Reconstructionist practice? What is it? Can you see aspects of what we do here that reflect this approach? How might a Reconstructionist approach not just inform our Jewish lives, our lives in Jewish civilization, but our lives in American civilization? What does this say about, participating in, getting out the vote campaigns or political issues or local community, peace, collaboration? And then the piece I want to focus on next week, but we'll hold space for any of the questions you have from tonight, are about what does Zionism look like through a Reconstructionist lens? And I'll give some of the history of Kaplan and Zionism, Kaplan's form of Zionism, and also talk about, there's, if you've read, and there's been articles since May in, Jewish magazines about the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College ordaining people who are explicitly anti-Zionist, and the concern about the Reconstructionist movement being labeled as anti-Israel and anti-Zionist. And so I can give a bit of context to that and share my own feelings about that. But it is a crucible for the Reconstructionist movement now. In some ways, these principles have left it open, right? We want to create an umbrella for all Jewish forms of Jewish identity. Does that include Jews who want to be rabbis who don't think the state of Israel should exist? Right? That's whoa. How broad is our, tent, right?
Is our beliefs.
Yeah, that's right. So it's testing, it's really testing this moment, right? Since October 7th and in this moment, and is testing that the competing principles, because Kaplan was decidedly a Zionist, and and I'm a Zionist in the ilk of Kaplan, and because of Kaplan's framing, because I'm not a nationalist, but I am anyway. So we'll talk about that, and I think that's relevant too. And the last thing on the handout were just things to brag about Reconstructionism, right? Because I'm not as careful about chauvinism as Kaplan was. The first bat mitzvah, Kaplan's daughter, Judith Kaplan Eisenstein, 1923. The first mother ordained as a rabbi was the Reconstructionist movement. Her name is Sandy Sasso. She's a widely known children's author, still alive and still writing. The first to ordain openly gay lesbian rabbis, to create a commission on homosexuality, leaders promoting interfaith inclusivity, creating rituals for interfaith couples before other movements were doing that. The concept of Jewish peoplehood and the promotion of the Chavurah as the Reconstructionist movement in its first generation was called the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations and Chavurot, FERCH, and for short. So this idea of you can do Jewish without a rabbi, it doesn't need to be a religious expression, etc. That piece, and you can go online and find 1,000 different Haggadot, the Haggadah for the feminist Seder and for the vegetarian Seder and for the, and what started that, blossoming, and for, Kaplan wrote a Haggadah in 1942, right? That took out chosenness. And that was, and he was excommunicated by the Orthodox Union. He was an Orthodox rabbi too, because of that, because of creating a new Haggadah, not because of all this rough ground, right? So it's just sort of breaking that ice, right? Breaking that glass ceiling of reconstructing, and even something as sacrosanct as the Seder, we can exercise our creativity, and engage it. So this is, I think, much of the ideas of the Reconstructionist movement of Kaplan have infiltrated and influenced American Judaism in ways you can't overstate. So we say it's a little bitty movement, right? In 100 congregations worldwide, and with an outsized impact, right? Boxing well above our, weight kind of thing. And that was a part of Kaplan's idea, right? He wasn't trying to create a new institution, a new movement, but have these ideas improve Jewish civilization, not just the Reconstructionist movement. And isn't that the role of the Jewish people in terms of the world and humanity too? We're not trying to make everybody else Jewish. So it's the movement that's doing for the Jewish civilization what the Jewish civilization is supposed to do for the world civilization. That's right. Maybe I'll stop with that.
There's a chat.
A chat? Oh,
It
thank
looks
you.
like there's a chat.
A thank you from Julie. Okay, great. Okay. She had to sign up early because she's on the East Coast. All right, well, thank you, friends. I do hope you'll come back next week if you're able. Thank you for being a part of this. I hope it gave you an orientation, maybe learned a new thing or two. And my also hope is that, that there's a bit of pride in Beth Evergreen and how it is adopted and evolved and helped contributed to this evolution. of Jewish civilization. All right.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, friends. Hopefully we'll see you at the John Denver Shabbat service outside on Friday night. Blessings. Thank-
Adapt or perish.
That's right.